Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. We are a certified social enterprise. We are mission driven, and our mission is to promote the ongoing reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. What we're finding, in very general terms, is that the authorities are not doing their job properly when it comes to protecting consumers from harm. In particular, the regulators seem to be rather lax at doing that. And what we found is that when they get things wrong, rather than tending to admit that and then going to work to put things right, we have generally found that when regulators get things wrong, they try to cover up their mistake and they create a false narrative to try to justify that ongoing pattern of getting things wrong. Tonight's session, as you all know, is about the business banking resolution service. We've been really focused on the BBRS in recent months because, in all honesty, there are more horrific, egregious examples of bullying and malpractice and malfeasance and misconduct and mis-selling by financial institutions in this space than anything else I've come across so far. What we've basically got here, folks, is the following reality. Many banks ripping off business owners deliberately to make money through exploiting the vulnerabilities of their customers. Let's remind ourselves, the victims were the customers of the banks. Rather than treating the customers fairly, the banks treated the customers appallingly. Got caught, no dispute there, they were guilty. The Financial Conduct Authority then allowed the banks to put in place a voluntary redress scheme. What's wrong with that? A hell of a lot. You know, this is effectively like having the burglar become the judge and the jury. Yeah, the burglar commits the burglary. Instead of being, investigated, prosecuted, and locked up, in this case, the burglar, the banks, have talked themselves into a position where they can decide whether they are guilty or not, and they can decide how much of a punishment to give themselves. And surprise, surprise, it seems that the banks have been able to use their power and use their influence through UK Finance, the trade body of the banks, to generate a supposedly fair and equitable and independent redress scheme that we think is anything but fair and independent and equitable. So this is serious stuff. And the reason it's really serious stuff is because people's lives have been ruined. Quite literally, people's lives have been ruined. And people are having to spend their waking days trying to find ways of battling against these banks. So this session is all about, what's left to be said. What is there to say about the business banking resolution that hasn't already been said in our previous meetings? And what I'm particularly interested in tonight is whether BBRS is independent as advertised. There was a lot of promotional activity before the business banking resolution service was launched. And as you'll be hearing, various claims were made about the BBRS's independence. Tonight, we're going to be comparing and contrasting what was described, what was promised, what was advertised, to use any other phrase, with the reality of the life experience that people have had using the business banking resolution service. We've got three particularly knowledgeable speakers tonight. Andy Keats from SME Alliance, which has been very close to this topic for several years, formerly with the ISG, the Independent Steering Group. Andy knows that his input is being very valued by those who are appreciating the fact that at this point in time, Andy is stepping up to the plate and sharing his insights and intelligence for the benefit of all. And Andy, I know, is very frustrated that he's been perceived by some, and the SME Alliance has been perceived by some, as not having the interests of SME victims close at heart all the time. I hope that Andy's talk tonight will help everybody to understand a little bit better what it's been like looking at things from his point of view. But of course, folks, you make your own minds up about what you see and what you hear. From my point of view, I continue to be off the scale grateful to Andy for bringing his insights and experience and sharing that with you tonight. Thank you, Andy Keats. We go from Andy Keats to Andy Candy, a very popular, very knowledgeable member of the Transparency Task Force community. Andy's been spending quite a bit of time looking at the transcripts of the meetings that took place during the launch of the Business Banking Resolution Service. I know that you're going to find Andy's talk pretty potent. And then we're going to go to one of the most potent people I know, being blunt about it, Steve Middleton. Steve's knowledge just blows me away. He knows so much. And as I've said to various people in small groups and large, I've been really learning to rate and respect Steve's opinion about a lot of things. He said various things to me over the years that to begin with, I thought, no, that can't be right. But as time has gone by, I think on every single point, he's proven to be right. So he's definitely somebody to listen to, folks. All right. So let's see how it goes. We'll go Andy, then Andy, well, me, Andy, then Andy Keats, then Andy Candy, then Steve Middleton. We'll have some chit chat along the way, like we always do. Feel free to use the chat. Of course, we'll circulate what's in the chat. The session's being recorded. So, be prepared to back up what you say. On that note, I need to, I'm going to press send on an email that I'm literally going to send now. In theory, in about a second's time, you should all receive an email from me. The email is from me to all of you, everybody that's booked onto tonight's session. And it's basically correspondence between myself and Dirk Patterson. Dirk Patterson is the gentleman at the Business Banking Resolution Service that I've been liaising with. TTF is very open and fair. Dirk, on behalf of BBRS, has asked that I circulate to all the attendees their view about issues such as independence, such as eligibility. So in that email trail, you'll see some recent correspondence where Dirk responds to various points that I've raised. You'll also see that I'm attempting to encourage the BBRS to come and speak at a TTF meeting. The idea, very simply, is we give the BBRS a chance to tell their side of the story and respond to questions. I don't know whether they're going to accept that invitation or not, but the invitation's out there. I'm certainly happy to give them a chance to talk. Don't fear that at all in any way, shape or form. The question is whether they believe, I'll rephrase it. The question is whether they're confident to deal with the insights, analysis, experience and questions that you folk and I might put at these meetings. So let's see what happens on that front. Okay, I hope that deals with all the background. Can we first put our hands together, please, for Mr. Andy Keats? And Andy Keats, thank you again for coming to the session. And it's going to be maybe 20 minutes, half an hour or so. There's quite a bit to go through. He's really going to finish off his expose from last time and bring us right up to speed with some developments over quite literally just the last 24 hours or so. Mr. Andy Keats, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. How are you? It's good to be here. The topic is bad, obviously, the BBRS, and what I want to do tonight is just to discuss some of the aspects of eligibility and independence. Not so much eligibility, but independence, both from a global perspective and from a case perspective. In terms of the end of my presentation from last time is a case. That case, my case, which myself and my partner put in. That's why I've been kind of quiet about this over the years, because I wanted to see what they would do with my case. While people were busy telling me that I was in bed with the banks, I wanted to see how they would get rid of my case, because I didn't think it was possible. They have, and it it took them 22 months or 21 months, I think it was, to actually do it. And it was done on a dismissal basis, which means that you can't appeal it. And the dismissal notice 100% misrepresents all of the evidence we submitted, and it also misrepresents council's opinion, which is very bad. And at this moment in time, council is considering what we're going to do about it, because the council is hopping mad. It's like I am, especially when they hide behind the veil of this is a dismissal notice and you can't do anything about it. So we're, on that basis, I just wanted to tell you first that I got a report from the European Banking Authority that absolutely 100% backs up what we've said to the BBRS, and 100% contradicts what the BBRS has said to us. And so I sent that banking report to the BBRS and they said, go away. I sent it to the FCA. I said, can you just check, can you just confirm this banking report by the European Banking Authority is correct? And guess what? The FCA have spent the last 2 months paying me, oh, you'll have an answer soon, you'll have an answer soon. And this afternoon, they sent me their response, which was, we're not going to give you a response. So they're not saying it's correct, and they're not saying it's not correct. They just decided that they're not going to. And all I wanted to know was, are you happy with this European Banking report, European Banking Authority report? They said, we're not going to tell you. So that's the FCA for you. Anyway, without further ado, what I'm going to do now is go straight into the sharing of the screen, and then I'll show you some of these misrepresentations. There are more, but I'll jump to them quickly as I can, so that you can actually see literal misrepresentations. Now, can you all see the screen? Is that?
Yep.
For you? Yep. Okay, so this is the dismissal notice. This is the end of it. And you can see that a dismissal notice has to be something that you cannot contradict. You know, I mean, it's a summary dismissal. The first thing that you see there is that this guy says, I am not satisfied that this complaint arises from a banking service. I'm not satisfied. He doesn't say it definitely he doesn't. He just says it doesn't, or he's not satisfied. So he says, I remain of the view this complaint does not arise from a banking service provided by the bank to company, to NSB. He's dismissing it. What he says is 5 things actually. What he says throughout the course of his dismissal notice, he says RBS didn't provide the banking services. Its subsidiary company WorldPay Limited, and he then says that WorldPay Limited took all the risk involved in card transactions, and that WorldPay Limited was the member of card schemes like Visa and MasterCard, that WorldPay itself could only terminate the merchant agreement, and that WorldPay could only retain a company's money if it wished to. None of those things are true. They are all completely refuted by the European Banking Court, but never mind. So let's go straight into the misrepresentation. So I think a good one. So I've got to get down there. Right. So this is one of the bits of information we took. We sent very few bits of information to them and evidence, because we wanted to really test them as to how they were going to get around this, because we knew that they were going to try and say that WorldPay provided the banking services. Therefore, even though the complaints were about the bank and what it did, they could get around it by saying that WorldPay provided the banking services, so therefore wasn't the bank, therefore BBRS can't look at it. So this is a KPMG engagement letter. The bank instructed KPMG to do a an assessment, if you like, of our business. It wasn't an IBR, a proper one. It was a project menagerie. Anyway, so you can see there, it says KPMG is writing to confirm the terms of the Royal Bank of Scotland PLC, acting through its agents, WorldPay, National Westminster Bank, and Streamline the Bank. Okay, so you've got a number of people there, and it's NSB Limited, which was my company, to deliver services in connection with this project menagerie. So you can see there that the main players there are WorldPay. Is it for WorldPay, or is it for Streamline the Bank? If I go straight down to what is Streamline? So Streamline is described as Streamline Merchant Services, the card processing arm of the Royal Bank of Scotland. That is Streamline. So let's see what the scope of engagement says. The scope of engagement says that KPMG will provide advisory services in respect of banks' current potential exposure, the bank's forecast potential exposure. They want to get the company, second bullet point, to provide cash flow statements to the bank, and they want to identify, fourth point, identify where bank's exposure might be mitigated, other key issues which affect the position of the bank. The KPMG report itself, which in actual fact BBRS didn't get because they didn't ask for it, that says, you can't see what the report says, but it says here, our work has indicated the current NPL Streamline face from customers claiming blah, blah, blah. It says, in the event of insolvency, Streamline's future exposure could be mitigated by blah, blah, blah. We understand that Streamline are obtaining legal opinion. And in the course of this, I just want to say that talking about the insolvency of our business, but they also note that the business turnover increased by 59% the previous year. And yet they're talking about our insolvency. Anyway, so Greg Barham, who some of you may notice from the BBRS, he's a senior case assessor. Now, he says, in relation to this KPMG engagement letter, the bank does appear to have been involved in the calculation of NPL and LGD. Some of you will know what that is. It's merchant potential liability and loss given default, which is actual liability, through KPMG, which it appears to have engaged to analyse the risk posed by NSB Limited. The risk calculation was internal information for the bank and WorldPay. That's not correct. It's the bank and Streamline and us, actually, company. I don't see that the bank was calculating these things as a banking service to NSB. No, we agree with that. It appears it was calculating them to inform its own view of the risk of chargeback WorldPay might face. I think we'd all agree that the chargeback risk was with Streamline the bank, not WorldPay. These theoretical chargeback risks, which are borne by WorldPay. Bank's interest seems to have been as the ultimate parent of WorldPay. The contractual arrangements for providing these services and taking on these risks were between NSB and WorldPay. It's bloody obvious from what I've just said, it's Streamline the bank. The whole thing is Streamline, the bank, the bank. If we carry on, that's the first one. That's his opening salvo, if you like. We get down to the next one. So this is a complaint I made in 2007 to the bank and to Ron Khalifa at RBS, and I say your actions appear to be completely without reason or none that you will tell us about. Our trading has remained impeccable at 4.01 million, with chargebacks amounting to less than £2,000. I've attached the record. I'd appreciate an immediate answer. What they're doing at this stage, they're keeping all of our revenue as it comes in, sale by sale, sale by sale, not remitting our card revenue to us, which is 100% of our company money. We don't have any borrowing with the bank. They're just keeping it on a contingent chargeback liability basis. There's my complaint. And if you consider what Greg Barham says before I go on to the actual evidence, I've done it the other way around this time. So he says the bank's interest seems to have been as the ultimate parent of WorldPay. That's his first bit. He says about this evidence, he says, with all that said, the former directors of NSB have now finally, nice of him to say that, provided me with some evidence that does indicate a complaint was made to the bank on the 23rd of November, 2007. He's trying the hardest he was earlier, say that we didn't make a complaint to the bank, we only made a complaint to WorldPay. So when he couldn't get round that, he's now accepted we did make complaints to the bank. He says, bearing in mind, he's talking about WorldPay's risk and WorldPay being the service provider. He says, my complaint was responded to on the 28th of November 2007, giving the bank's giving the bank's view of the risks the business represented and its reasons. He doesn't say it's for WorldPay because he's already said that. And he says further correspondence followed between solicitors for the business and WorldPay. That's not true. It was with the bank's lawyers. And there is some evidence that complaint about the bank's role determining the remittances should be retained and the merchant agreement terminated. And the issue was the level of risk the bank felt was involved. Now, you've got to remember this in context, that he's talking about risk to WorldPay and services to WorldPay, okay? So if we have a look at the letter itself, is the letter from RBS to me. You can't quite get over this. Bearing in mind, this is what he said. There is a letter. That's all he said. The bank's view of the risks the business presented and its reasons is the letter. Right. Ooh. So I'm only going to read the highlights because Tony Rossiter is the Senior Credit Risk Manager for RBS, not WorldPay. He understands the bank. I understand you're asking the bank to release £27,000. I've reviewed your facility with WorldPay. That's the only mention. Now listen what happens. The bank has given you notice to terminate the business. It says that only WorldPay can terminate the business. After which the business will migrate to Barclays. Okay, you've requested 27,000 of the funds held by the bank. Barham says only WorldPay can hold the funds. It says the bank has agreed to extend this period. Explain it will be beneficial if I explain the bank's position. It became clear to the bank that your business model, blah, 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 provided an unacceptable risk to the bank. Remember, he's talking about WorldPay all the time. Financial risk to the bank. You're aware of the content of the KPMG report. It said the business was, I can't remember, it says that you confirmed the accuracy of the report. No, we didn't actually. Anyway, earlier this year, the bank reviewed the business website. The bank concluded that in a direct breach of understanding between the bank and the business was again selling lifetime memberships. The bank's risk profile was therefore not reducing in line with the KPMG report, blah, blah, blah. The bank served notice of termination. Greg Barham says only WorldPay does that. Says that until the bank's potential losses are known, says it's WorldPay's losses. The bank's stance, withholding funds the bank is contributing to the trading difficulties. It's unacceptable for the bank. Return for settlement funds the bank currently hold. If the bank has misunderstood the position, then I invite you to explain it. I understand there being ongoing discussions between the bank's lawyers and business lawyers. Greg Barham says it's between the business and WorldPay. The bank has indicated something or other there, blah, blah, blah. We'd need extra security. The business has justified their stance by claiming there's no financial risk to the bank. I'm nearly there. Sensible financial proposals to wind down the processing card processing facilities with the bank. And I hope this matter can be resolved between the business and the bank. Right, sorry to get excited, but how many times? 24 references to the bank and 1 reference to WellPay. And Greg Barham, the senior case assessor, completely ignores all of that. Following day, there's an email.
Andy, excuse me, can I just come in with a question here?
Of course you can.
This might be a really stupid question, but I feel like I need to ask it. Did the assessor see that letter you just shown us?
Refers to it.
Right.
That's what he says. I'll just show you again.
No,
refers to that.
Okay. It is staggering that he's come to the conclusion that your relationship with, so to speak, was with WellPay and not the bank. I just don't get it. Okay,
well, here you go. This is the next email before I go on to the council's opinion. If you remember, Greg Barham says in his dismissal notice that discussions continued between the bank, between the business and WellPay's lawyers. LA Piper are the bank's lawyers. They're RBS's lawyers. They say, in answer to my question, they say the bank will today pay £27,000 to NSB. In consideration for the payment, NSB agrees that the acquiring facilities with WellPay will be terminated the following day at 4 p.m. And there will remain the risk of the issue of the balance of funds held by the bank. It's not held by WellPay, it's held by the bank. The bank's costs will be deducted from those funds pursuant to the terms of the agreement. The balance of the funds will then be held by the bank until such time as the bank considers the risk profile of NSB allows further payment. It was 10 years, by the way, they were going to hold those funds. There will also need to be an acknowledgement that NSB do not intend to pursue any claims against the bank. So there's a bit of a blackmail email, really, because they're saying they will release £27,000 to pay my staff, only if we stop trading the following day, allow the bank to take all its costs from the funds that is kept from us, and then acknowledge in writing, it will be necessary to do this in a formal agreement, that we do not intend to pursue any claims against the bank. Otherwise, it's not going to release the £27,000 to pay our staff. We're going to be terminated anyway. So it's a very interesting email, that one. Greg Barham just refers to it in terms of, he just literally says, bank's interest seems to be in the ultimate parent of WellPay. And it is again, he says, my complaint was responded to on the 28th of November, 2007, giving the bank's view. That's the email that you questioned me on. It says further correspondence followed between the solicitors for the business and WellPay. That's not true, it's with the bank. And there is some evidence that a complaint was made about the bank's role in determining the remittances should be retained. The bank says that it retained the remittances and says that it terminated the merchant agreement. And the issue was the level of risk the bank felt was involved. He says was risk for WellPay, not the bank. It's quite clear from what I've just shown you, just those two bits, and there are others, that the risk is with the bank. Actually, I'll just quickly say, when we were terminated, WellPay, in the same termination notice, offered to keep working with us with another acquirer bank, which he corrected Mr. Barham to, but he ignored it. So let's go on now to the council representations, which are, if anything, even worse. So Simon Reevell, the answer to Greg Barham's initial assessment in June last year, before the dismissal notice in November, we got council's opinion and sent it to BBRS. So Simon Reevell says, put simply, WorldPay was the conduit by which RBS acquired funds on behalf of the business for transferring those funds into an account onto an account under the business's direct control. Conversely, WorldPay did not at any point hold funds or provide any service to the business involve the control or distribution of monies. Means that RBS did. Okay. And he says it's also worthy of note that WorldPay's current guidance to prospective merchants emphasises the need for them to open an account with an acquiring bank. So it's not a bank account, it's just an account with a merchant account. So that's what you have to do. Now, Greg Barham, look at what he says. I've got it up here in a chart. See that? On the left is what Simon Reevell says, and on the right is what Greg Barham says. He says, legal opinion states that the bank provided an account to which WorldPay transferred funds from the business before transferring them again to the business, should say NSB's business account. WorldPay did it. He says WorldPay was the council says WorldPay was the conduit by which RBS acquired funds. He's misrepresented it. And then the second part, Greg Barham says, Simon Reevell says, conversely, to make the point, he's ramming it home, WorldPay did not hold any funds or provide any service to the business involved the control distribution of monies. And Greg Barham says, it says WorldPay did not hold any funds. So he quotes Simon Reevell, the second part of that paragraph. So what he's actually doing is Barham is saying, leaves the reader wondering whether the legal opinion contradicts itself. Because the way Greg Barham has formatted it, he's completely misrepresented the first bit, and he's quoted the second bit as though contradicts the first bit. I mean, it's outrageous. It really is. So the next bit of counsel's opinion that he has a go at is this business about the opinion says WorldPay's current guidance to prospective merchants emphasises the need for them to open an account with an acquiring bank. Well, it isn't a bank account. And it's quite clear from everything that's said it isn't a bank account. But Greg Barham decides to turn that around, and this is what he says. He says on the left-hand side here, the right-hand side as you're looking at it, he says, this is not a matter that arises from the bank's provision of a merchant bank account. While the bank provide a separate banking service in terms of providing a merchant bank account, what risk of chargeback WorldPay might face arises from the bank's provision of the merchant bank account. Do not see that how the issue of what risk of chargeback WorldPay arises from the provision of the bank account. Legal opinion states the bank provided an account which WorldPay transferred funds, which is the bit I was just reading you. And that's the bit that obviously is not correct. It's completely incorrect. It says, I accept that the provision of a bank account is a banking service, blah, blah, blah. It's not a bank account. In WorldPay's termination notice, termination by WorldPay, they say to us, additionally, we'd also welcome the opportunity of providing you with a quotation for our payment processing only solution, Bank Direct. This requires an internet merchant account with an alternative acquirer. If you're interested in this option, please do not hesitate in contacting me for a quote. We directed Greg Barham to that termination notice, prove that it wasn't WorldPay that was terminating us, it was RBS. They were requiring WorldPay to do it under the terms of the merchant agreement. But Greg Barham doesn't have any of it, and he just keeps repeating that it's not RBS, it's WorldPay that's providing these things, and it's WorldPay that's terminating. So So Greg Barham goes on, all the blue bits here are all Greg Barham talking about the bank in providing a bank account, which he never did. We never had a bank account from RBS. And he ends up, this is the misrepresentation, ends up by saying legal opinion appears to concede that this is actually a complaint about the payment services provided by WorldPay. I can see you shaking your head here, Andy. Let me just say what I'll find a little bit of so here you go. So this is what our council opinion said that he had with him. It says this is what Greg Barham says in his initial assessment. The complaint made by the former directors of the business. For some reason, this has gone mad. It should say NSB. It's not a complaint about RBS's provision of banking service. It's a complaint about the provision or withdrawal of a banking service by WorldPay, right? A former subsidiary of RBS. That's what he first said. So the opinion said, in order to understand the fallacy of that observation, blah, 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 he says, this letter of the 23rd of June, Mr. Barham somehow fails to understand that once the function of RBS is established, it's immaterial whether WorldPay also provided banking services, but it's difficult to see how that could be so, as WorldPay has never held a license to provide the same within the UK. It's difficult to imagine that RBS would wish to argue that its wholly owned subsidiary was providing unlicensed banking services throughout the relevant period, and that RBS itself is somehow thereby absolved of responsibility for its actions. Goes on. These banking services, as such, were provided were provided in the relevant period by RBS. Conclusion. At the conclusion of an analysis of the content of Mr. Barnes' letter, it is impossible to justify its finding that the complaint may be legitimately dismissed pursuant to section whatever it is, SC 151, the scheme rules. Conclusion is that the bank complaint is not about a banking service provided by the bank, etc. So when you think about all those things that council says, how the hell does Greg Barham come up with legal opinion appears to concede that this is actually a complaint about payment services provided by WorldPay? You cannot get your head around it, can you? And what Greg Barham does is, this is the last one I'll show you now, but there are others. There's plenty of others. I'll show you this one. What he does is, answer to council's opinion that it's WorldPay couldn't provide a banking service because it hasn't got a banking license. Barham says, in relation to the point made about banking licenses, WorldPay was able to provide payment services and is regulated to carry out payment services, which is what it, not the bank, appears to have provided to NSB Limited. Absence of a banking license does not mean that it could not carry out payment services. Now, I've had a conversation. I can see Andy smiling because I've had a conversation with him about this. But if you notice, this is the sort of thing I notice. He said when Greg Barham says that WorldPay was able to provide payment services and is regulated, is using the past tense and the present tense in the same sentence, which seems a bit unlikely to be able to do that. So I went to see what he's on about. And I looked just at my merchant agreement, which says WorldPay Limited registered number 342752, that's their company number. And I went onto the FCA website to see how they are regulated and when. So here's WorldPay, their number 03424752. And let's see when they were regulated. 13th of April 2018. When they were dealing with me, it was in 2007. Weren't registered with the FCA at all till 2018, and they still can't provide banking services. They can just pay. Everyone within card payment services has to be regulated. That's it. And even if you look at the address of the Royal Bank of Scotland, it says Royal Bank of Scotland Group, PLC, Global Transaction Services Division, Global Merchant Services Credit Section, 2.5 Devonshire Square, London. The address of WorldPay is WorldPay Limited, 270 to 279, The Science Park, 170 Milton Road, Milton, Cambridge. Greg Barham is busy telling us through dismissal notice that we cannot appeal, that WorldPay took all the risk for all 400,000 of its customers, which would be in the billions. It only had in 2007, it only had a turnover of 10 million. The net profit, a gross profit, I think it was, of 6 million. It was trying to tell us that, Greg Barham is trying to tell us that the bank's false calculation of our risk at 2.5 million, one customer of WorldPay, somehow makes sense to Greg Barham. It just doesn't. It's complete crock of crap, the whole thing. They even charged us, or RBS even charged us. WorldPay gave us a quote for a direct solution where they charge us 13p and 10p for a gateway and fraud screen services. And they said payments will be made by your acquiring bank. You need to add WorldPay direct rate to your acquiring bank charges. Barham's got all this. We said to Greg Barham, then for us World Direct Service, which is where RBS is the acquirer bank, in the acquirer bank services. And we say, look at the lovely words. Thank you for the business you've already passed through WorldPay. You're a valued merchant, ! We hope that your business continues to grow. Then we say, look, credit card transaction increases 200% when RBS is involved, and nearly 150% for a debit card transaction. He's ignored it all. So that, my friends, is the end of that. I'll just show you, the last thing I'll show you here is Greg Barham gets the complaints right. He says the complaints have been framed to the BBRS as the bank misrepresented card scheme rules to create a false impression of the risk bank faced from the business. Merchant potential liability and loss given default were massively miscalculated in order to exaggerate the risks the bank faced. And the bank claimed that the business was selling products that were not acceptable, and these contributed to the risk the bank faced or faced by the bank. And that was not the case. These are the complaints. But they're not going to look at them because he's saying that WorldPay provided the services. That is it. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Andy. If I try to summarize what I believe you've been saying, you've basically explained that you had a complaint against the bank. You went to the BBRS to get that settled and sorted. After, I think it was quite some time, it was 18 months or so of going through the process and having previously kind of got every tick in every box about eligibility. At the very end of the process, you were told by the BBRS, you're not going to get redress because your issue, as it wasn't with the bank, it was with WorldPay. Despite the fact it's obvious from what you just explained that your contract and your services would be provided.
No, that's actually the wrong way around. What they're saying is that under the scheme rules, the services which you're complaining about have to be provided by the bank.
Yeah. Right.
So they're saying that although they recognise that all the complaints are about what actions the bank took, actually the services were provided by WorldPay. To back that up, he said that WorldPay, says that WorldPay takes the risk and it's the member of card scheme and it terminates you. And in other words, the bank is the parent and it is on looking like just pleasantly surprised by what WorldPay is getting up to. And just has an input every now and again because it wants to. It's turned everything on its head. Therefore, we're not eligible to have a complaint reviewed. That's what it said.
Right. And okay, so they've given you their sort of decision. They've told you you can't appeal against it. What are you planning to do, Andy?
Okay, so gone to council, and council has already accepted that these are gross misrepresentations. We've been back to the BBRS and said, look, even if it's a dismissal letter that you can't appeal, you certainly can't ignore misrepresentations and inaccuracies. Let's call them inaccuracies. Have to be corrected. And the BBRS respond by saying, well, no, they don't, because it's a dismissal notice and that's the end of it. It doesn't matter. We just support our Greg Barham. So we are now going to King's Council with council's opinion, and we are going to actually take the BBRS to court for bad faith, essentially.
Right. Thank you.
What we're going to do. That part of the presentation, if you like, that is the presentation, but that demonstrates to me that Greg Barham, like it or not, is acting as the defender of the bank. There's no doubt about that. He cannot justify these things. They're not errors. They are real. There's a real effort there to dismiss our complaint from the system. Now, I don't know what relationship he's got with this bank. I certainly know he was ex-pos. I can't go any further than that. That's an individual instance where integrity of the BBRS and the independence are clearly called into question. So moving on, this afternoon I sent to the BBRS the what I should say, I've never said in public, I don't think before, but I recorded the final BBRS ISG meeting. Recorded it because I was really concerned that things were going very, very, very wrong indeed. And I was concerned that the minutes wouldn't reflect the meeting. Don't. I recorded it. I've given the transcript and the recording to the BBRS this afternoon. I've given them the ISG minutes, demonstrate that they don't reflect what happened in the meeting at all, and how that meeting was closed off was okay for the meeting, not for the minutes that followed, and certainly not for the way the scheme's been run since then. I've also given them a statement of truth, or a draft statement of truth, which next week I'm going to have turned into an affidavit. And that statement of truth reflects what's happened with the bank appointed member, and how the scheme was set up, and how it was manipulated and changed, and how the bank appointed member is now the company that is actually controlling the rules and controlling the scheme. And it includes my report from 2020, or extracts from my report in July 2020 to the BBRS, which said my report included that the volume that the BBRS would get would be circa 620 complaints, of which I didn't estimate, of which I said would be less than 36 eligible complaints for the BBRS as it stood. And they dismissed my report and said, no, it will be 60,000 eligible complaints, and they wouldn't listen. Andy knows that now they've been to the Bees Business School, apparently, and they've come up with a figure of 14,000 eligible business complaints, and which they expect 1,200 to 1,400 to go to the BBRS. What's actually happened is that there are 590 historic complaints, which is very close to my 620 figure. The eligibility criteria was changed without our knowledge, and that has made the eligible cases 7. 7 eligible cases, and I think I know how they. I won't explain why they're eligible, but I think I know how they've become eligible. And I think the big thing that I've put in my witness statement and also in the email that I sent to the BBRS this afternoon is that in April 2020, some of you may have been in the pilot scheme. Has anyone here been in the pilot scheme for the BBRS? Andy, right, there you go. So the pilot scheme was chosen, 30 instances chosen by Alexandra Marks, the chief adjudicator. She said would be eligible and non-complex. And I had a conversation with Alexandra Marks, more than one actually, but I had various conversations with Alexandra Marks, and I said, you will find they're not eligible. Each one of those is not eligible. It is complex. And she said, no, she laughed many times over a drink even, saying, no, it's not going to be the case, Andy. I've chosen these carefully. I didn't know which ones they were. And she said these are eligible cases, and they were, and they're non-complex. And one by one, each of those cases was stopped during the pilot period because the banks were saying, we don't think this is eligible. and or they were found to be very complex. And I've set out in my witness statement that I believe 29 out of the 30 were eligible for review. And that became clear week after after BBRS went live on the 15th of February 2021. And I've said all along, you must know that you've got a problem, because if the hand-chosen 30 complaints are all ineligible, all bar one maybe, and I think that one was a push payment fraud that got paid 150 quid. They're all ineligible. The scheme is not going to work. It cannot work. And in my report, I actually said, this is a warning. It is my last sentence. I said, this is a warning to the BBRS. This is going to be successful. And we are where we are now.
Andy, thank you so much for taking the time and the trouble to share with us your insights and what you have today. We're going to be moving to Andy Candy very, very shortly. We'll have a Q&A discussion session at the end. But Andy, obviously, very, very good luck to you on your own individual case. Please keep us posted with how things develop. And if you're ever in a position to share your witness statement more broadly, please do so. It will be of great interest to a lot of people.
Well, as soon as it's an affidavit, and what I've done is I've sent it to the BBRS, and I've said, is there anything wrong with what I've written in here? And if there is, you come back to me. If there isn't, I'll go and get it torn, the witness statement of truth next week, and then I'll do what I want with it.
Okay. Well, let's show our appreciation for Andy Keats, please, everybody. Thank you very much indeed, Andy. Thank you very, very much indeed. Brilliant stuff. Okay. Well, clearly, the question, is the BBRS independent as advertised, is a very relevant question, both to the conversation we've just had with Andy Keats and also, no doubt, to what we're going to be hearing from Andy Candy. Mr. Candy, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. So everyone can see that all right?
Yeah, all good. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll leave it on screen while I just read through a couple of bits. I mean, I won't sort of dawdle too long on it because it's more about what's on screen. But this is to do with transcripts that were taken of the BBRS webinars where they're waxing lyrical about how brilliant the service was. I mean, the main sort of summary is that the BBRS executives were fully aware throughout the whole process of the extremely contentious nature of both the draft and final approved eligibility criteria. And of course, of the significant objections raised by a huge number of different people, from commentators, campaign groups, experts, individual applicants, and indeed members of the ISG. The BBRS event transcripts provide useful evidence of public statements repeatedly made by numerous executives at the BBRS, which gave potential applicants who were told not to self-exclude the clear understanding that the BBRS board and executives were entirely independent and had the powers to carry out reviews and make necessary changes to the scheme to ensure it delivered on its aims and objectives, as they admitted were defined by Philip Hammond and the Walker Report, etc., not least by the terms agreed between the SME and bank panels. However, at no time did the BBRS executives during any of these webinars mention the bank appointed member, the BAM, or the critical control powers it held over the BBRS. They did, however, go to the lengths to explain that they were extending their original remit by including a bank and SME liaison panel post-launch to keep them informed of how the service was operating. But again, they didn't mention the BAM, which was obviously a much more serious entity. Mr. Shan Smith was both chair of the BBRS board and the independent steering group. So he has no excuses for omitting this critical information while at the same time waxing lyrical and explicitly assuring victims that the BBRS board itself would not sign off any documentation that would compromise its independence, which is what you can see in this text on screen here. The entity that is the BAM absolutely and unequivocally compromises the board's integrity and independence. There's absolutely no question about that whatsoever. It's my opinion that Mr. Shan Smith and the board are at fault for allowing this entity to be put in such a position in context of the BBRS's operating architecture and for effectively misleading the public and MPs watching the BBRS webinars. It's also no coincidence that the event transcripts and videos have all mysteriously vanished from the BBRS website where they were previously available for people to view. Clearly, it's not a coincidence. I mean, you can see from this highlighted text on screen here, he couldn't mention the word independent more times if he could try. And again, as I said earlier, he says, I can categorically assure you that the BBRS board will be independent, the company will be independent, and because it is independent, this is really matters most. So it's also worth defining here that they're quite happy to blame the banks and the SME liaison panel and steering groups for effectively agreeing the criteria and they're just working with those. But the BBRS board executives had an absolute responsibility to ensure that the organisation they were taking control of was independent and wasn't going to be influenced. And the BAM is not, that it fails on that alone. So they are to be held responsible for that, not the ISG, not the banks. It's down to the BBRS board that allowed that to happen. Here's a following additional item. Again, Lewis is being questioned on these factors. And here he again highlights that we're going further than the original remit. The banks have done this in good faith. I mean, the banks don't do anything in good faith. The idea is just an abomination. He claims that the boundary mechanism is taking us much further than they originally envisaged. And that we should be grateful to the banks for that. I would argue that any examples of where the boundary case has been effectively utilised would prove that that's not been the case at all. Again, he refers to the documentation is now going through its final phases and every detail is being scrutinised. The board is independent and will ensure the independence not only of the company, but of the complaint handling function. He's talking bollocks, excuse my French, but it's not independent. The BAM has power of veto over any changes to eligibility criteria in the future. And this is something that was touched on by Alexandra Marks and others, but I'll talk about that in a minute. But as I say, he makes a very point about they're going beyond their original remit and that they've introduced the SME liaison panel, but again, doesn't mention the BAM, which has a far more critical impact on the service. And if victims had known about this, they probably wouldn't have signed up to the BBRS because they would have known that ultimately they were going to get shafted by the bank one way or another, either via the boundary case scenario, which the banks have control over, or via any changes to eligibility. So despite the fact that Shan Smith and Marks categorically assured people that changes would be made if it wasn't making up, if it wasn't working, they forgot to tell us that that was actually under the control of the banks. Here again, Samantha Barris, who again jumped the ship early, a bit like Marks leaving a sinking ship. But here again, another example of another executive separately giving assurances about the independency of the BAM, the independency of the board and everything else. And again, reiterating to victims that the banks have been unambiguous in their commitment to making sure that the BBRS could operate independently. Well, that's an interesting concept. She's claiming that the banks have been unambiguous about their commitment to the independency of the the BBRS, and yet they implemented and set up the BAM, which has a controlling interest in that. So this is either a lie or she's been misled as well. It's complete nonsense. The whole of the transcripts I've searched for, not the BAM or bank appointed member is not mentioned once in any of them. That's not an oversight. It's not an omission. It's deliberate misrepresentation as far as I'm concerned. I don't think if there's anything else in there. I mean, she waxes on, and so it's in our DNA as an organisation, and certainly on the part of the stakeholders operating with us, that we need not just be independent, but be demonstrably independent, and that there is a confidence in that. Well, there is none whatsoever, and the BAM destroyed any of that whatsoever. Again, also to point out at the end here, she says there will be full transparency of our governance documents on the websites. Well, the BAM wasn't mentioned in any of those when the service launched, and it wasn't until individuals like Steve Middleton and Tim Layton and others exposed the existence of the BAM that suddenly this term appeared conveniently on their website. But yet again, not in any of the text resulting from any of the webinars. So again, misrepresentation, lack of transparency, misdirection. They're just lying. Here you've got John McLeod again asking questions at the SME Roundtable event. Here he questions Rachel Cooter from Osborne Clark on this. Irrespective of advice given to the panels independently, she clearly makes public statements here assuring everybody that corporate lawyers have looked at all of this and that the BBRS is independent and the banks aren't pulling the wool over our eyes. Well, why is there no mention of the BAM? Why is there no mention of the controlling interest that it has and how that's going to impact on the future running of the service? The BBRS directors can't run an efficient organisation that's not meeting its criteria of dealing with a significant number of complaints if they can't change that criteria to address that matter. And I'm not aware of any efforts made whatsoever to change the criteria or address those failures. Finally here, this sort of exchange appears in several different events, but effectively John's asking Alexandra Marks here about the eligibility criteria. And what you'll notice of interest is that it's not just a case of that it's a set in stone factor once the scheme launches. So they already knew it was contentious before it launched, but post-launch they were very clear that they were going to be constantly reviewing and updating this criteria and then making adjustments. And the very last sentence you will see, we will consult with stakeholders that will include the banks and the SME community, but she does not make it clear that actually it will in fact require the sign-off of the bank appointed member. So she's given everybody the understanding that they're going to be able to look at how it's working, and if it's not functioning, make changes to the scheme. She can't do that. That's a misrepresentation. She must have known about the BAM by this stage of the proceedings. I would say that's a deliberate misrepresentation. I would be very interested, but as she's not given any interviews on this or made any statements, it's hard to know what was in her mind at the time of making this. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's not particularly conclusive either way. I think that's pretty much everything that's worthwhile saying from it. As I say, no mention of the BAM in the transcripts or the events, and clearly they're misleading and missing out a lot of useful information that victims weren't able to therefore make an informed decision about applying for to putting forward their complaint, into the BBRS for assessment. So I think that's all I've got, really.
Andy, that's remarkably potent. I mean, that really is remarkably potent. I'm going to I'm going to say what I think your evidence shows. I think your evidence shows that the narrative leading up to and during the launch of the BBRS is that it was going to be independent and that it was going to be a genuine effort to treat the claimants independently and fairly. And the narrative is that they were going out of their way, not only to be independent, but to look like they were being independent. That's essentially what the comments you just shared with us say to me. And at some point in time, the bank appointed member ends up in charge of the business banking resolution service, the bank appointed member being an entity created by and run by the banks, how can anybody claim that the BBRS itself is independent? It's just so far away from that. It just seems completely and utterly an unjustifiable position to take. And your point, Andy Candy, seems to be that if people had known that that was the deal and that was the reality behind the veil, the veneer, then nobody would have had any faith in it at all. And it would have not had the legitimacy that it eventually got through various stakeholders who basically said, yeah, this should work. It looks like it's got potential.
There was a huge amount of misdirection, a whole factor of points. They weren't open about the minimum £1 million turnover for the scheme, which ousted a whole host of people. They didn't make it clear about the net or gross assessment of assets in terms of eligibility. They didn't mention anything about the ban. Rachel Cooter in her statement said that we wanted to make sure that the BBRS didn't have to keep going back to the bank cap in hand to ask for changes. Well, that's a complete nonsense. The BAM absolutely renders the BBRS non-independent. They might be able to refer to the scheme as it was set up and signed off in the criteria, but Alexandra Marks categorically said that it would be an ongoing review of those criteria and how appropriate they were working. Also, in regards of the complexity of certain cases, meant that they wouldn't be able to foresee criteria that would become relevant. So there was absolutely a categoric statement that those changes would be made on the basis of evidence viewed as they were reviewing cases once they'd gone live. But she categorically did not say that that would then have to have the approval of the BAM to sign that into existence. So again, it's misleading, because if we'd have known that, if we'd have been told that once the boundary case route had been implemented, that the bank would have power of veto of that, and they would have power of veto of any changes to the eligibility, people wouldn't have bothered signing up, because you were told to sign up irrespective of whether you were eligible or not to self-exclude. That was a constant statement used throughout the webinars. Please don't self-exclude. This isn't a set in stone tick box eligibility criteria. It's all flexible. We'll apply it on a case-by-case basis, and we'll look at it from that perspective. And the banks have agreed to deal in good faith. All nonsense, all proven to be a lie.
And Andy Candy, how do you feel about the idea that BBRS is backed by the banks? They're very litigious. I've had correspondence from them, as you've seen, and others have had correspondence from them that suggests that don't defame them, etc., etc. How do you respond to that sort of position that the BBRS is taking? Don't openly criticise us is essentially what they're saying. If you slander us, if you commit perjury or libel, whatever it is. What's your sort of emotional reaction to that?
Well, it's hardly on the basis that they set themselves out to be linked to CEDR, the dispute resolution and mediation approach, and they're constantly talking about being neutral and doing both sides. They're not taking that approach to any of their dealings or any criticisms. I mean, the fact that they claim that they shortlisted 40 cases to go through to the pilot is a nonsense. Barely 11 got through the whole of the process. So they fabricated the results on everything, and then they threaten people when they threaten to reveal the basics of what they've done. I mean, they're just taking a bank attitude. It's there's very little difference between the BBRS and just straightforward the banks. I mean, they're all got a bank background, or the Ombudsman, which is equally aggressive in its stances on things, and the FCA. It's not a way to they're not practicing what they preach as far as mediation is concerned.
Thanks, Andy Candy. I think Andy Keats wants to come in here. Andy?
Have I just shared that on the screen?
We can see it, yeah.
This is this was their we were provided in 2022 the means, the SME liaison panel. It was never ever discussed in the working groups, never discussed in the setup of the BBRS, and this is what was given to the SME liaison panel as the means to make changes to the scheme rules. And I think what Andy's just said there is absolutely bang on in terms of you can see that I've highlighted in yellow approval there. So in order to do it says the SME and the bank, the SME liaison panel and the bank liaison panel agree on proposals to change. Consideration will need to be taken into account operational implications, etc. Third one is recommendation to the BBRS board. The BBRS board recommends a rule change, formal consultation process with the banks and SME liaison panels. The BBRS BBRS LT and board was, I don't know, consider any changes from original proposal, and then they have to go for bank approval.
Yeah.
BAM approval.
Yeah. Same thing. Yeah.
That's it in a nutshell, isn't it? Now, that was something I promise you, we never ever got told any of this, never mentioned ever. And there's even an advice that the 7th, I just put it in the chat, on the 7th of December 2020, where it's quite clear the advice is that BBRS are going to be independent.
Andy Keats, thank you very much indeed. I mean, you've just seen the picture there. It has to go through BAM approval. So how can the BBRS be independent of the banks if the controlling party is the BAM and the BAM is owned and run by the banks? I just don't get it. I just don't get it. Thank you very much indeed, Andy Candy, for sharing your evidence, and Andy Keats. We're going to go to Steve Middleton now. Steve, and then after Steve, we'll have a bit of a Q&A catch-up general chat. Mr. Middleton, what would you like to tell us about this general theme? Is the BBRS independent as advertised? Your thoughts, please, sir. Thank you.
So effectively, unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to prepare anything specifically for tonight as a presentation. But I'm just going to talk you through my thoughts and what I found out about the scheme, both as someone who was initially eligible to join, somebody who has acted as a consultant, somebody whose a firm has been through the scheme, and as an ex-banker and financial advisor. And is the BBRS independent? No, it's a sham. It was a sham from the start. It was always meant to be a sham. It was a response to the fact that a decade of entrepreneurs and SMEs had become disenfranchised with the banks and would not borrow from the banks and still had ongoing legal battles. And that was in response to several years in particular of outright criminality in the banks, several years going on to a decade. And much of that criminality went back to things like swaps, fixed rate loans, the asset protection scheme. And unfortunately, many of those problems and the worst behaviours in relation to those things led back to the involvement of HM Treasury. HM Treasury were in control of RBS when many of the worst behaviours happened, and similarly with Lloyds. So what you have is you have a joint thought process or a group think in the regulator, because Andrew Bailey, Nicol Rathie, Sam Woods, who head up the PRA, the FCA and the Bank of England, were integrally involved in all of the HM Treasury's shenanigans and wrongdoing back then, and in setting up things like the asset protection scheme. So there's a group think process in Whitehall, in the government and the regulators, that the real issues about the banks need to keep being covered up. And you don't do that by having a tribunal service or any actually independent service analysing the wrongdoing, because what it would find is systemic wrongdoing and systemic criminality. So there had to be an answer, and what they did was come up with this hybrid false plus answer. And the whole intention of it from the off was for the banks to have complete control of it, as far as I'm concerned, and I think there's clear evidence of that. Did the ISG members representing SMEs know what was happening? I can't say for definite, the truth will out. I didn't vote for the people who represented SMEs in this. There are 7 million SMEs, and SMEs should have been represented by people of the calibre that the banks were represented by, with the same level of banking and financial expertise and background, and the same level of legal expertise, is my view, but that's just my view. The whole issue of the BAM, the way it was done, I mean, how covert. You have the ISG ends on the 9th of February 2021. The members stepped down, which there were 3 members back then, who were all persons of significant control, because in theory they had a 33% control of the firm. They handed back their shares effectively. And then there is a board meeting on the 12th of February 2021. Now, everyone can jump up and down and say, well, if you're going to have a board meeting, you've got to have notices. If it's an EGM, everyone's got to be notified. It's got to be done this way, that way. Generally, that's true. However, if you have the allowance in your mem and arts for the members or directors to call a board meeting, generally at will, as long as they all agree on the matter, then effectively you can forego all those formalities. So under the normal formalities, the previous members should have been notified about this meeting on the 12th of February 2021, but to our knowledge, they weren't. The three members having stepped down, three directors of the BAM then stepped forward on the 12th of February 2021. And what they did immediately was then adopted the new articles that brought in the bank appointed member. Now, what they also did was brought in articles that allowed more than 3 members. So straight away, the other 4 directors all became members. By doing that, the 7 directors, none of them had more than the prerequisite 25% shareholding to register as a PSC, a person of significant control. So they diluted the membership down to avoid that PSC registration. Obviously, at one point during that meeting, there were 3 members who were PSCs who did not report that. And then obviously they adopted this new member arts with the BAM. And the key point here, as we all now know, is that what the BAM became as a member, it didn't control the company, it simply controlled all of the rules of the company and all of the rules of the scheme. Now, I'm sorry, but if I control the memorandum and articles of a company, and the directors cannot change them without my approval, I control that company. Yeah, I've got the power of veto of any changes they want to make. If I then control the rules of the scheme that they're running under, and they can't make any changes without my approval, I have control of that company.
Mm-hmm.
So the BAM, the bank appointed member, should have been registered, and it wasn't. And it not only wasn't registered, it was kept a secret. So, okay, fine, it's in the public domain, it's on Companies House, but only if you look and find that. Well, luckily, Tim Leaton very kindly did that for us at the TTF and found this BAM issue. But then what I was shocked when I found out about it, that nobody had looked into this and found out exactly who it was. And then I found out that even current SME panel members had asked the question and were not being told. I think when I spoke to Andy Keats about it, he thought it was maybe a group of people or maybe one person who wasn't sure. I speculated at the time it'll be another company and there'll be all the banks involved. So following that, I did this section 116 request to the BBRS. I've never done one before. It's just something I looked up online. And effectively, if you want to find out who's on a company's register, you can make an application under section 116 of the Companies Act, and they have 5 days to block your application. And to do that, they've got to get an injunction at the court. If they don't manage to do that within 5 days, they have to disclose the register. That was quite interesting because I submitted this request on a Sunday afternoon and heard nothing. And it got to 4:30 on the following Friday when I got this phone call from a BBRS director or manager, and basically saying, we've got this request from you. Do you know who we are? And I said, well, yeah, of course I know who you are. I said, well, we're not a bank, you know. And I said, I know you're not a bank. And so, well, you've made a request to see our register. I said, yeah, that's correct. He said, you sure you haven't made a mistake? And I said, no, I've not made a mistake. I want to know who your members are. That's why I made the request. Oh, I don't know what to do. We'll have to check with our legal team over this. So obviously at that point, I was quite pleased because it's past close of business, 5 working days after I'd made the request. So they can check what they want with the legal team, but they've got no right to withhold the information. So the following week, I got the information, and it was exactly what I suspected. It was a firm called the Resolution Service Appointed Members Limited. And it is staffed by 7 people from the 7 participating banks. Simon Amers of Lloyds, he's the head of corporate at Lloyds. I've dealt with Mr. Amers on the Foskett review, and I can tell you that on the Foskett review, the bank are being as dishonest and as corrupt as they ever have been through the Griggs review and everything else to do with the HBOS Reading. Paul Graham Bastow is head of lending products at Barclays. Christopher Paul Fallis is CEO at Santander. Peter Alexander was UK Small Business Banking Director at HSBC. Ian Russell head of home buying at Danske Bank. Matthew John Tuck is head of product service at NatWest, and Guy David Williamson is head of risk at Virgin Money. So what you basically have is the people in those banks who would be responsible for or would have significant input in whether compensation was paid on these matters. And that's how it works at the banks. If you have some form of review, they put the people in charge of the review process from the area of the bank that would pay the compensation. And that way they always have a vested interest in trying to keep a lid on compensation that's paid and how much it costs the bank. And often they'll be targeted on minimising compensation. So they're the very people who have control of the rules of the BAM and effectively control of the BBRS, despite anything that's been said. Now, the BBRS have suggested that they don't have to register the BAM. I don't agree with them, but they've gone to Companies House and said there is no relevant legal entity or person of significant control. I believe that's entirely untrue. We've had or seen an opinion that backs up what I've alleged here, and also confirms that it's a criminal act for the company and directors not to register the BAM. Now that's a criminal act that can be settled by a fine, but it's an ongoing criminal act if we're correct about this. And for those who are members of the BAM themselves, potentially it's a criminal act where you can go to jail for up to 2 years if they're part of a PSC or relevant legal entity position and they haven't registered it. So all I would say is, look, if this was all open and upfront, why did they do it the way they did? Why didn't they just change the memo notes earlier? Why didn't have the ISG involved at the time? Wasn't that all done before the sign-off? Why did they have this very short notice meeting where all of this was done in one day and then never mentioned? And to me, that's only done for one reason, and that's they're hoping the fact that nobody's ever going to get to look at their register or see who that BAM is. Yeah, well, fortunately, we got to do that. And when a company behaves like that, you think, well, if that's their behaviour in a normal corporate setting, you know, who are these people? You know, do we trust their integrity? Well, again, coming back to the ISG, you know, I looked at this early days, and there's a person on the ISG, in theory, representing SMEs called Lucy Armstrong. And I'm going to get Clive Maters to mention something about this in a minute. And Lucy was the head of professional standards, the Professional Standards Council at UK Finance. At the time, she was put forward to represent SMEs. Well, UK Finance, the bank's lobbying, the lobbyists, they represent all of the bank's interests. How would you possibly put somebody who's very closely in bed with the banks and working with them regularly? She advises fund management companies that are completely funded by RBS alongside other people. Why would you possibly choose that person to represent SMEs and think you're going to get the right results? It's ludicrous. And, you know, the Professional Standards Council deal with asset finance and issues around asset finance. Now, I'll bring Clive in at the end of this if I can, because he'll tell you about a meeting that he and I did with Lucy Armstrong, where we raised very serious allegations about fraud at RBS Invoice Finance that related to Clive's company. And he will talk you through the kind of response we got from Lucy in terms of wanting to know about fraud at RBS. Now, going a step further, I mean, we know a little bit about Mr. Shan Smith, but I thought I'd just have a little bit more look at Mr. Grimshaw, who has now stepped in as temporary CEO at the BBRS. I didn't know too much about him. Now, it's Mr. Grimshaw who's been corresponding with me on some of the issues that have been raised about the person of significant control. Well, interestingly, at the time that he came on board as the temporary CEO, he was still an associate director at the UK Cabinet Office, where he was doing various project works for the UK Cabinet Office. Now, that interests me because I thought the government, in theory, had nothing to do with the BBRS or any connection with them, yeah, and were entirely independent of that. Well, that's very interesting that he's working there at the same time as an associate director, no less, at the same time as being on the BBRS. Now, what I was quite concerned about with when it came to Mr. Grimshaw is some of the statements that have been made about the success so far of the BBRS and how it's worked. Now, we've all had or heard about these payments out, this wonderful £1 million that they've paid out on what, 40, 50 odd cases. And what did Mr. Grimshaw say? That it was significant amounts, that it made people even who hadn't been paid out, he said, they had transformational changes in their lives. I'm wondering just how delusional this guy is. Because, you know, if you talk about the fact that the average payout, if everyone was paid a similar amount, the average payout is maybe less than £20,000. You know, I've worked on bank cases since 2013-14. The lowest payout I've ever seen on a case I've worked on is just short of 100,000. The majority of them are hundreds of thousands upwards into the millions. Now that's real representative of losses that people have, certainly in relation to swaps, GRG, other things like that. So why is he so positive about this £1 million payout over 2 years? And obviously the fact that 60,000 potential claimants has resulted in 14 adjudications, 14 on legacy cases from potentially 60,000 potential complainants. Well, looking at Mr. Grimshaw's LinkedIn profile, he tells us he's a demonstrably successful chief executive, managing director and chief operating officer. Yeah, well, okay, fine. So where has he worked so well in the past? He's a former Director General, apparently, in UK Senior Civil Service. Well, we know how well the civil service has performed in relation to the Asset Protection Scheme, RBS, Lloyds, and the various other banking issues that civil servants have got involved in, where criminality has been rife. Well, previously, he was at the Rural Payments Agency. So I didn't know too much about this, but this is controlling the European subsidies and payments to farmers. And when he was there, they were heavily criticised, and he was singled out for criticism because in 2014 to 15, sorry, in 2014, they achieved 97% payments to farmers. Now, when you achieve 97% payments, it sounds fantastic, but that means there could still be several thousand farmers who haven't had their subsidies they rely on every year to live by. But they brought in some new European regulations in 2015, and under his direction, the level of payments dropped to 54%. So there were farmers who couldn't afford to live, couldn't afford to pay their bills. It was so bad that they actually had to start providing bridging loans to farmers while they sorted their subsidies out. The agency faced continual criticism from the select committees at Parliament, and even as he left the agency, his ex-colleagues were being called in front of the parliamentary committees to talk about how it was failing in its core duties and how it was failing in the payments it was making to the farmers, many of whom were suffering very badly. So that's his fantastic success at the Rural Payment Agency. So where was he before that? Well, again, another fantastic success. He was at the Child Support Agency. Now, when he was at the Child Support Agency, he was criticised while he was in charge of it for actually having accumulated 3.4 billion in unrecovered payments, yeah, from errant parents. And some quotes about how the agency was run. Edward Lee, Conservative Committee Chairman, said, "The reform of the Child Support Agency has been one of the greatest public administration disasters of recent times." Yeah. Richard Bacon, Conservative MP for South Norfolk, said, "I cannot recall a more badly run programme in the public sector. It is now clear that the CSA bet all or nothing on ambitious last chance reforms and then lost, leaving the agency broken and beyond repair. Absentee parents know that avoiding their responsibilities is easy, and the chances of the CSA taking effective action against them are low." Okay. And one of the biggest issues they were criticised for, compensation. So a man who believes that less than £20,000 is a life-changing event for you after maybe 10 or 15 years of being a bank victim, perhaps this gives us an idea of where those thought processes come from. What was said about the Child Protection Agency is that compensation has not been remotely fair or reasonable, nor is it restoring people to anything like the position they should have been in. Does that sound familiar? Now, a couple of examples of that. one woman who had been waiting for a payment decided to bring a case against the CSA. She'd been offered a £200 ex gratia payment of compensation. In her case, the arrears had been assessed at £27,000. That could no longer be collected because the CSA failed to make an assessment in 1994 and failed to serve documents on the father until 2005, an error which they acknowledged. So they acknowledged their failures left to that family, that single mother and children, to lose £27,000 in income, and they offered £200 in compensation. Another case, one client has just received a payment of £450 from the CSA. The agency has had her case, the care case, for 13 years, and maintenance owed by the father of her children was assessed at £60,000. The father should have been tracked down and made to pay, but due to the CSA's ineptitude, he slipped the net, the solicitor says. The money offered is derisory. So again, another family on the breadline, £60,000 there out of pocket, were offered for all that failings, £450. This was while Mr. Grimshaw was COO of that organisation. Now, I know that may be slightly abstract from this argument about the independence of the BBRS, but I think you have to look at the people in there and what they're saying and what they're doing. And when somebody can literally stand up and start applauding the fact that they've paid out £1 million in 2 years on 14 adjudications to legacy cases, when there were hundreds, well, certainly tens of billions of compensation that were due to those real victims, 60,000 at least potential victims, and £1 million being paid out after 35 million plus has been spent on setting this case up. Do I believe that that person is independent in any way or has any interest in SMEs or SME compensation? No, I don't. He's been put in there to do a job, the same job he's done badly at other agencies, where he's going to turn the blind eye to all of the failings of the organisation. And what has happened here is the BBRS has been used as a sham to sign off all the legacy misbehaviours, kick the can down the road, run limitation down, and fail to pay out the billions in compensation the banks really owe.
That couldn't have been a more hard-hitting session that we've ever had, Mr. Nicholas. Thank you so much. I am you're kind of like angry and confused. How and why would somebody with that kind of track record be put in charge of an organisation that, according to Philip Hammond, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, had an objective to rebuild trust and confidence between banks and businesses? Why would you choose somebody like that to do this kind of job? It just blows my mind. Steve, that was absolutely remarkable.
Andy,
yeah,
you hit the nail on the head there, Philip Hammond. Now, when I was working Revenue and Customs, that man was devious as a rat up a drain pipe, and nothing has changed. So he is the man instrumental in this problem.
Wow, crikey.
Can I just read one more thing out, Andy? Sorry to interrupt there, but I couldn't find this paper earlier.
I'm blown away by what you explained.
This was Mr. Grimshaw's quote when he joined the BBRS. I am sure that my organisational leadership experience, working in the interests of sometimes vulnerable or economically stressed service users, will prove beneficial during my time at the BBRS. Now, I'm sorry, next to single mothers on the breadline and farmers unable to pay their bills because they're not getting compensation, there are very few more distressed people than the SMEs who went through the credit crunch. And many of them are financially vulnerable, have mental health issues, have many other problems. And to have a person like that in charge, to me, is absolutely disgraceful.
This all adds to the narrative that the BBRS was never something that was meant to do its job properly. That's all the evidence seems to be pointing to that. I can hardly believe this. Andy Keats, you've got your hand up, sir, and then we'll throw it open. Andy Keats.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on what you said there, Steve. This afternoon, I wrote to the BBRS, like I said. I picked up on your point in a way, but it's slightly differently. I said, it's nonsense. This nonsense is frankly insulting. those businesses who've been complaining non-stop from as far back as 98, from as far back as 1998. It's shameful that the BBRS publicity claims that SMEs have walked away with life-changing sums of money if it's a lucky lottery win. What the SMEs have received is only compensation for perpetrated wrongs to their businesses in the past, which has resulted in losing their business and livelihoods, in many instances becoming a bankrupt as a result. I said, the compensation should be fair and generous, which I doubt are the words on any SME lips concerning the BBRS. If an SME has received a life-changing sum, it is only a reflection of the damage done by the bank in the first place. It's clear to me that SMEs are treated as second-class citizens by the banks and then by the BBRS. And I'll go on and say more, but I won't bore you with it. I was picking up on the fact that they're sort of jumping up and down about this £1 million, and yet 2 months ago they wouldn't tell the SME liaison panel anything, because they said if they did, it would identify the complainant.
Yeah.
But this £1 million, it's not evidenced by anything. This is just a figure they've come up with. They're shouting about it, and on the other side of the coin, what they're saying, if you look at all the narrative, is that the complaints are far fewer than they thought, and they're all non-complex. They're not complex, but they're trying to get you to. They're trying to get the narrative to the fact that, you know, someone has not received a checkbook on time, and they've complained about it. It wasn't resolved, and now they've been resolved. It's almost that bad, and this is the misrepresentation that's going on now. Finished.
Thank you, Andy. Steve, you indicated that Clive might want to come in on a particular point. Clive, if you wish to do that, please do so now. Thank you.
It's just about Lucy Armstrong. So through whistleblowers, Steve wrote to, well, in fact, we had a conference call with Sir Norman Lamb, Sir David Anson, as he is now, whistleblowers, Steve, Bank Confidential. The whistleblowers told Norman Lamb and David Anson that what RBS Invoice Finance was doing was illegally assessing same bank customers' files. Because I banked with RBS Invoice Finance could go into the files, find out what we've got on our asset and liability statement, and then set far higher level credit limits so their suppliers could supply our company with materials, because RBS Invoice Finance was making big money at the time. What they also said was when they went onto our credit files, any liability that they gave, or any credit level, in our case it was up from 100 grand to 150 grand, the liability was placed against the directors and guarantors of the business. So my supplier was using confidential invoice finance, which we weren't supposed to know about. Between the bank and RBS Invoice Finance, they agreed this credit, this insurance, or this limit that this supplier could supply us with materials to, which, like I say, went up from 100 grand to 150. RBS then applied that level against me. So that meant we were £150,000 in debt to the bank that we knew nothing about. So when we gave this information to David Anson, he wrote to the FCA and he wrote to Ross McEwen. The FCA said, and this was Charles Randall, said there'd be a notational 10% limit lodged against the persons insured. So if it was 100 grand, 10 grand would be against us. Ross McEwen said to David Anson that the full amount would be lodged against us, but it wouldn't affect our borrowing ability, which was a load of cods. So we got in touch with UK Finance, the asset protection people, the asset people like Lucy Armstrong was involved in. The first contact was
Professional Standards Council, Clive. They regulate the asset invoice finance area.
That's it, just Steve. Alex Waterman was the first people we dealt with. Well, when we checked Alex Waterman out on LinkedIn, he was involved with RBS Finance before he went to UK Finance. So that's basically like going to, Harold Shipman about the tablets he were being given. Between us, we got a meeting organised between Alex Waterman, Lucy Armstrong, and me and Steve. On the day we got there, Alex Waterman didn't turn up, but Lucy Armstrong did. Steve had on his laptop all this evidence that he was prepared to give Lucy Armstrong. And as soon as he opened up his laptop to give Lucy Armstrong this evidence, she turned her head away and wouldn't look at it. She physically wouldn't look at any of the evidence, saying she couldn't get involved. Now, if this is a person who's an SME representative under the BBRS, and this is at the time the BBRS was going, this was 2019, the very fact that her head's turned away and didn't want to see anything, you know what I mean, that says it all. And in the end, what she basically said was, because there was no contractual contract between me and RBS Invoice Finance, we had no right to complain against RBS Invoice Finance, despite the fact that they placed a liability against us, which caused us almost, well, it did cause us at the time to go into GRG. I mean, at the time we went into GRG, they had £100,000, well, our supplier had £100,000 credit insurance on us. Now, that was good insurance back in the downturn. At the time we're in GRG, RBS Invoice Finance increased our up to 150,000 at the same time that the bank are saying that they're concerned about our overdraft usage, saying we were distressed. Now, what sort of company can place £150,000 credit insurance for RBS Invoice Finance to be able to sell or buy invoices from this company to supply us material if we're distressed? I mean, Woolworth went under because all the credit insurance was pulled on them. How can we be chucked into restructuring, being classed as distressed, when they're up in the insurance? We raised all this with Lucy Armstrong, and she didn't want to know. So that's the caliber of the BBRS SME representatives. You know, if that's one of them, you know, we've got no chance. Like you said about Target Armour, you might as well put the wolves in charge of or whatever it was, the fox in charge of a chicken shed. Well, this is exactly what they're doing.
Thank you, Clive. Thank you very, very much. This is mind-bending. Steve, I think you put your hand up again, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, make no mistake, Andy, this was an out-and-out fraud. They were charging, what they would do on invoice finance, they were selling debt protection, but they didn't have a license with the FCA to sell insurance. So they trained everyone to talk about this is a bit like an insurance, but it's not insurance, and that's how they used to sell the product. And they were charged generally about 1.5% per month with the debt protection and the finance. Without it, it would be about 0.7, 0.8%. So it was a fairly significant income for them when people took the debt protection. But then when they had the in-house customers, you see, what they were doing is charging customer A for the debt protection insurance, even though they didn't have a license to sell insurance. And then they were putting that whole liability directly on the credit file of customer B, who didn't know anything about it. Yeah, and his personal guarantees would also cover that without his knowledge. So if they saw, in Clive's case, at one point, Clive, when they started taking Clive's overdraft down, they took him down from, I think it was 250 grand to £50,000. At that point, he had a £50,000 overdraft. That was the extent of his facilities, apart from a small commercial loan. But they had actually secured him up with double guarantees for £950,000 on security. Yeah, so the whole thing was an absolute scam, and it was only when I started looking into it and getting these letters written by the MPs, they actually shut down the debt protection arm within 3 months. Before they responded to the MPs, the business was that area of the business was shut. They actually passed it all on to Euler Hermes, and they actually gave Euler Hermes additional funds to take on the customers.
Right. And
they did that before they responded to the MPs. And Lucy Armstrong didn't want to know anything about it. And she's one of the key directors on the BBRS as we speak.
This is mind-boggling. This is outrageous, isn't it? This is outrageous. I'm not often sort of stuck for words, but this is just like there's just no credibility here. There's no credibility at all. Okay. Let's open up. Before we do, could I please ask everybody to join me in thanking Clive and Steve and Annie Keats and Annie Candy for what they've covered so far. It's just been, even after all these months and years, tonight's session has even opened up my mind to just how bad it is. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, for what you've done tonight. Thank you very, very much. We'll open up to everybody else that may want to come in. So please raise your hand either digitally or, of course, literally, if you want to come in with a comment or a question or an idea. Please just wave away if you do. It's roughly 10 to 8 now. We can wrap it up quite shortly or a bit longer if you want to. Can I ask Stephen Barker, is there anything you want to come in with, Stephen? Often you've got some particularly interesting insights and ways of looking at things. Anything you want to say, Stephen? You don't have to, but if you do, please fire away. You might be on mute, Stephen.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Sorry. Hi. I was taken with everybody's surprise about the gentleman that Steve Middleton referred to, but he actually made it into a book called The Blunders of Our Government by Professor Anthony King and Ivor Crew, which is a very interesting read for anyone who's interested in public administration. And the Child Support Agency captures a whole chapter. And at one point they had 520,000 outstanding claims, and monetarily it ran to absolutely millions, a total shambles. So really what this book says about that and a variety of other examples is that government can get it massively wrong. And if we think our situation is somehow unique, it's not as unique as you would think. So consequently, when we're thinking about going forward, undoubtedly, it's going to be very difficult to get government and all their agencies to stand up and put their hand up and say we got it wrong. Because in all these examples that they've recorded in the book, they don't do that. They effectively shut it down, or they create something anew and hope to try and get it sort of sorted out. Now, we don't need that, because if they shut this down and we stop doing what we're doing, then we are effectively out of the game, if I can call it a game. And we're out of the game in the way that I think is afoot, which is the proposals we're seeing the Chancellor prepare for further, I'll not call it deregulation as such, but re-regulation. In other words, an amendment to the current system or the immediately historic system. BBRS is part of that story. It was one attempt, and we'll see other similar attempts, to introduce deniability, to remove government from the process, to remove the Treasury. And by the way, the Treasury is a person of significant control with the FCA. You know, so the responsibility for the conduct of the FCA must go back through that person of significant control. It's the same argument that Steve outlined with BAM. Yeah. And yet the Treasury, as we know from the observations I've made previously, they don't actually seem to know who the Secretary of State is that has similar powers to it. How can that be after 22 years of the Act being in force? So all I'm saying is that it's interesting, but I'm not sure we're actually going to make a lot of progress trying to unravel government. Somehow we have to find a way, as Andy Keats is doing, I suspect, with a very specific case and the opportunity to get it into a court.
Yeah. I think if the evidence that's been shared tonight and the other stuff from other meetings, etc., if that evidence went in front of an objectively minded, evidence-based individual who had power and influence to decree what should happen, I can't see anything other than it coming down on the side of the victims here.
I agree.
I think you're right to praise the FCA. I mean, you said this point so well some time ago, Stephen. The FCA were not justified in effectively delegating the responsibility of sorting this mess out to the banks and giving them complete reign and freedom to do it whatever way they wanted in a completely unaccountable way. So the FCA has got some big questions to answer as far as I'm concerned. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to come in on at this stage? Just raise your hand if you do. Mr. Nigel Harper, you've got your hand up. Go for it.
Just a couple of things. I put a note out about the King. I think that's a very appropriate note to put out because I'm working bloody hard to get his attention. I'm talking to everybody about the King and I'm tweeting all about the King, getting rid of this rotten government and ordering a general election so we get rid of the ministers who are destroying this country. That's on one side of things. On a slightly easier subject, I've just written to Gideon Moore, who is now chief counsel to the old RBS, NatWest, remonstrating with him about the fact that Alison Rose is being very dilatory in attending her appointment with the Treasury Select Committee. And I've sent him loads of questions that I want the Treasury Select Committee to ask her. They are tough questions. She won't be able to answer them, I know that, but they are relevant questions. So if anybody's got any ideas of questions you need to send, please send them to Lord Premsicker or Susan Kramer or Sharon Bowles. Please send the questions so we can at least get them to the Treasury Select Committee. I want to make her life hell.
Well, thank you, Nigel. Thank you very much for sharing that. Does anybody else have anything else they want to come in on? It looks like we're all done. It looks like we're all done. I know I'm repeating myself, but can we please take a moment to once again thank Andy Keats, Andy Candy, Steve Middleton, Clive May, and everybody else that's been contributing.
Thanks, guys.
It's been great, as it so often is. Thank you very much indeed. We'll wrap it up there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go and have your tea if you haven't had it. I'll go and get mine now. Thanks, guys. Thank you very much indeed.
Cheers.